China, an ancient civilization with a vast land, rich history, and 1 billion people. Singapore, an island nation, barely 700 square kilometers, with a population smaller than some Chinese districts. On the surface, they had little in common. Yet, in 1978, something unexpected happened. Deng Xiaoping, China's paramount leader, arrived in Singapore on a mission. His country had just emerged from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. Its economy was in shambles, and its people were struggling. Deng knew China needed change, but change required inspiration. For years, China's propaganda had painted Singapore as a running dog of the West, a place that had turned its back on its Chinese roots. But when Deng stepped foot in Singapore, he saw something else: modern infrastructure, order, efficiency, and wealth. At the center of it all was one man, Kuan, a leader who had taken an impoverished island with no natural resources and turned it into an economic powerhouse. Deng had to know, how did Singapore do it? For 3 days, the two leaders talked. Li didn't hold back. He told Deng the hard truth. China's problems weren't because of imperialism or foreign interference. They were because of China's own policies. If China wanted to succeed, it needed to change. Deng listened carefully. He took notes. He asked questions. And when he left Singapore, he had made up his mind. China needed to reform, and it needed to learn from Singapore. What happened next would set China on the path to becoming the world's second-largest economy. But first, let's go back and see just how desperate China was before this historic moment. Before we dive into what Deng learned from Singapore, we need to understand what China was like in 1978. And to put it bluntly, it was a disaster. For decades, China had been trapped in cycles of political purges, disastrous policies, and economic failure. The Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s had led to the worst famine in human history, killing tens of millions. The Cultural Revolution in the 1960s tore Chinese society apart, with students attacking teachers, neighbors turning on each other, and chaos gripping the nation. By the time Mao Zedong died in 1976, China was broken. Its economy was stuck in the past. Factories were inefficient. Farms couldn't feed the people. Foreign investment? Non-existent. While countries like Japan and South Korea were modernizing, China was still trapped in a system that simply didn't work. Deng Xiaoping had seen enough. After maneuvering his way back into power, he knew China couldn't keep going down the same road. It needed to open up. It needed to grow. But how? Deng looked around the world. The Soviet Union? Too rigid. The United States? Too different. Europe? Too far removed from China's reality. But then, there was Singapore, a tiny nation, but one with a Chinese majority population. If Singapore could become rich and powerful, why not China? That's why, in November 1978, Deng boarded a plane to Singapore. It wasn't just a diplomatic trip. It was a mission to find answers. What he saw in Singapore shocked him. Not just the modern buildings or the bustling economy, but how the country was run. The order, the discipline, the efficiency, and most importantly, the pragmatism. Deng had come with questions. Kuan had the answers. And over the next 3 days, China's future would change forever. On November 12, 1978, Deng Xiaoping landed in Singapore. He wasn't there for sightseeing. He came with a mission: to learn. Singapore was a paradox to China. It was small with no natural resources, yet it was thriving. Its people were mostly Chinese, yet they had created a society that was modern, orderly, and rich. How? That was the question Deng needed Kuan to answer. Li, a man known for his sharp mind and brutal honesty, didn't sugarcoat anything. He welcomed Deng but wasted no time in pointing out why China had problems. It wasn't because of foreign interference. It wasn't because of imperialism. It was because of China's own policies. For 2.5 hours, Deng spoke about China's concerns: the Soviet threat, Vietnam's growing aggression, and China's struggles. The next day, Li responded. And he was direct. Li told Deng that Southeast Asian leaders weren't worried about the Soviet Union. They were worried about China. Why? Because China had been supporting communist insurgencies in the region. China's radio stations were broadcasting messages to ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, telling them to rise up against their governments. Li looked Deng in the eye and said, "You want us to work with you against the Soviets, but my neighbors want me to work with them against you." Deng was caught off guard. He closed his eyes, paused, and then asked, "What do you want me to do?" Li's answer was simple. "Stop it. Change your policy. Then we can work together." Deng listened, and that moment defined the relationship between these two men. Li wasn't just giving Deng a lesson in diplomacy, he was teaching him how to lead a nation. By the time Deng left Singapore, he had a new perspective. He saw how a strong, disciplined government could create a prosperous economy. He realized that China didn't need democracy to succeed. It needed order, efficiency, and pragmatic leadership. Within 18 months, China stopped funding communist insurgencies in Southeast Asia. But that was just the beginning. Deng didn't just listen to Li's advice, he was about to use it to transform China itself. Deng Xiaoping left Singapore with more than just diplomatic insights. He left with a blueprint for China's future. Lee Kuan Yew's Singapore wasn't just wealthy. It was stable. It was disciplined. It was efficient. And most importantly, it worked. Unlike China, Singapore had no farmland, no natural resources, and no massive labor force. Yet, it had managed to become an economic powerhouse. Deng took note of 3 critical lessons from Li. First, Singapore's government wasn't just powerful, it was competent. Li made sure that only the best, most capable people ran the country. He didn't rely on ideology, he relied on results. Corruption crushed, incompetence removed. Everything was about efficiency and performance. Deng realized that China needed a government that functioned like Singapore's, not driven by political loyalty, but by competence. He saw that even an authoritarian state could thrive if it was run effectively. Second, Singapore had figured out a way to welcome capitalism without losing control. Foreign companies invested, businesses thrived, people got rich. But the government never lost its grip on power. There were no protests, no riots, no instability. Deng saw the genius in this. China didn't need to copy Western-style democracy to become successful. It just needed the right balance of economic freedom and political control. And finally, Singapore was a hub for international business. Why? Because it built the right environment, world-class infrastructure, low corruption, and investor-friendly policies. Companies from all over the world came to Singapore because they knew their investments were safe. Deng understood that if China wanted foreign capital, it had to change. It had to build modern cities, protect businesses, and welcome outside money. And so, in 1980, inspired by Singapore's model, Deng created China's first special economic zones. Shenzhen, a small fishing village, was turned into an experiment in capitalism. Factories were built, foreign investors were welcomed, rules were relaxed. It worked, money flowed in, jobs were created, and China's transformation had begun. But Deng didn't stop there. He knew he needed help, so he made an extraordinary decision. He invited Singapore's former Deputy Prime Minister Dr. Goh Keng Swee to help China design its economic policies. China wasn't just taking inspiration from Singapore, it was actively learning from its leaders. And the results? Nothing short of historic. When Deng Xiaoping returned to China after his 1978 visit to Singapore, he knew one thing for sure. China had to change, and fast. He had seen with his own eyes how Singapore, with no natural resources and a tiny population, had transformed itself into a thriving economy. If Singapore could do it, why couldn't China, a nation of nearly 1 billion people? But Deng also knew that China couldn't simply copy the Western model. That was out of the question. The Soviet model? It had already failed. China needed something unique, something that would allow it to modernize while still keeping the Communist Party firmly in control. And so, in a historic move, Deng introduced a radical new idea: socialism with Chinese characteristics. It was socialism in name, but in reality, it was a bold experiment with capitalism. And the first step? Creating special economic zones. Just like Singapore, China needed controlled environments where foreign businesses could invest, factories could be built, and workers could earn better wages. In 1980, China established its first 4 special economic zones, with Shenzhen as the flagship project. At the time, Shenzhen was nothing more than a sleepy fishing village. But Deng had a vision to turn it into China's own version of Singapore. And within just a few years, that's exactly what happened. Exactly what? Shenzhen became a testbed for China's economic future. Here, the government allowed foreign investment, gave businesses more freedom, and relaxed strict communist-era regulations. It was a complete departure from the rigid economic policies of Mao's China. And the results were staggering. Money started pouring in. Factories sprang up overnight. Wages skyrocketed. By 2020, Shenzhen's economy had even surpassed Hong Kong's. What had once been a small village was now a global metropolis. But Deng didn't just take inspiration from Singapore. He went a step further. He invited Singapore's former Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, to personally advise China on how to modernize its economy. Dr. Goh had been one of the masterminds behind Singapore's economic success, and now he was working directly with China's leaders to bring that same model to cities across the country. His influence was massive, shaping China's policies on infrastructure, investment, and governance. And then there was the Suzhou Industrial Park, a joint project between Singapore and China in the 1990s. This was Singapore's economic model, transplanted directly onto Chinese soil. The idea was simple. If Singapore had figured out how to create a world-class business environment, why not replicate it? It wasn't easy. At first, there was resistance and the project struggled. But over time, it became one of the most successful industrial developments in China, proving that Singapore's model could work on a much larger scale. Deng Xiaoping's decision to learn from Singapore wasn't just about economics. It changed the course of history. Before his reforms, China was isolated, poor, and stuck in the past. After his reforms, China became a global powerhouse with an economy that would go on to reshape the world. And it all started with a visit to one tiny island that showed him what was possible. China's transformation didn't stop with special economic zones. The lessons from Singapore kept shaping the country in ways few could have predicted. What Deng Xiaoping had seen during his 1978 visit wasn't just about economic growth. It was about how a country could be run efficiently while maintaining control. And this idea fascinated him. Singapore had managed to balance strict political control with an open economy. Foreign businesses were welcomed, capitalism thrived, but the government never lost its grip. There were no chaotic political uprisings, no constant changes in leadership, no instability. Kuan had built a government that was powerful, but also incredibly efficient. And that efficiency was something Deng wanted to bring to China. That's why, in the years after his visit, China kept turning to Singapore for advice. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Chinese officials were regularly sent to Singapore to study its governance, urban planning, and economic management. They wanted to learn how to run a country that was both modern and disciplined, where the government didn't just dictate policies but ensured that they actually worked. One of the most ambitious projects to come out of this cooperation was the Suzhou Industrial Park in 1994. This was a massive joint effort between Singapore and China, designed to bring Singapore-style urban planning and economic zones directly into China. The idea was to create a model city, one that would attract businesses, promote efficiency, and showcase a new way of doing things. But this wasn't a smooth process. At first, there was resistance. Local Chinese officials, used to working within China's old bureaucratic system, struggled to adapt to Singapore's structured meritocratic style. There were conflicts over management, disagreements over policies, and even a period where Singapore considered pulling out. But over time, the project found its footing. Today, Suzhou is one of China's most developed and prosperous industrial hubs, and its success paved the way for future collaborations between the two countries. More importantly, it showed that while China couldn't copy Singapore exactly, it could take its best ideas and adapt them on a much larger scale. Even beyond economics, Singapore influenced China's approach to governance. The fight against corruption, the focus on long-term planning, and the emphasis on administrative efficiency, all of these ideas were reinforced by what Chinese leaders saw in Singapore. Kuan became something of a legend in China, frequently consulted by top Chinese officials well into the 2000s. But as China grew into a global superpower, the relationship between the two countries also changed. The student was starting to surpass the teacher. China was now the world's second-largest economy, while Singapore, though still influential, was a much smaller player on the global stage. The question was, what would happen next? Despite the incredible transformation China underwent, the bond between Deng Xiaoping and Kuan remained strong. Even though Deng never returned to Singapore after 1978, he kept in close contact with Li for years. The two leaders may have come from vastly different backgrounds. Deng, the battle-hardened communist revolutionary, and Li, the Western-educated lawyer. But they shared a deep respect for each other. Li continued visiting China almost every year, meeting with top Chinese leaders, offering advice, and sharing his insights on governance and economic development. While Deng was the one who initiated the reforms, Li was often seen as the wise mentor who helped guide China through its rapid transformation. And China took his advice seriously. By the time Deng stepped down from power in the 1990s, China had become almost unrecognizable from what it was in the 1970s. The once isolated country was now one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. The lessons from Singapore had played a crucial role in that transformation, shaping everything from China's urban development to its fight against corruption and its ability to attract foreign investment. In 2010, to mark 20 years of strong bilateral ties, Singapore honored Deng Xiaoping with a memorial celebrating his role in shaping modern China. But China went a step further. In 2015, after Kuan Yew's passing, China awarded him the Reform Friendship Medal, one of its highest honors, recognizing his extraordinary contributions to China's rise. But as much as China learned from Singapore, there was one thing it could never quite replicate: the rule of law. Kuan Yew had built Singapore on a system of strict but fair governance, where corruption was wiped out not just by strong leadership, but by a legal framework that held everyone accountable. China, on the other hand, maintained its top-down approach. While it fought corruption through political purges, it never fully adopted Singapore's independent legal system. And as China grew into a superpower, its relationship with Singapore became more complex. Singapore was no longer the model that China looked up to. It was now just another small player in a world where China dominated. But history won't forget the role that Kuan Yew played in shaping modern China. He was more than just a leader of a small island nation. He was a man who changed the course of history. And without him, China's rise might have taken a very different path. The story of China's rise is often told through the lens of its internal struggles, its powerful leaders, and its massive economic reforms. But hidden in that story is a surprising truth. One of the world's largest nations was profoundly shaped by one of the world's smallest. Kuan Yew didn't just influence China, he gave it a vision of what was possible. He showed that economic success didn't have to come at the cost of political stability, that a disciplined and pragmatic government could transform a struggling country into a global powerhouse. Deng Xiaoping saw this firsthand in 1978. He listened, he learned, and he applied those lessons in a way that would change China forever. His decision to open up China, to welcome foreign investment, to build modern cities, these were all shaped in part by what he saw in Singapore. Of course, China is not Singapore. It never could be. The sheer scale, the history, and the political realities are entirely different. But what China took from Singapore was the idea that a country's fate isn't decided by its past. It's decided by its leadership, its policies, and its willingness to adapt. Today, China stands as the world's second-largest economy. But as it faces new challenges, aging demographics, slowing growth, and increasing global tensions, the question remains, will it continue to follow the pragmatic, adaptive spirit that Deng Xiaoping embraced? And if not, will China still remember the lessons of Kuan, the man who helped set it on the path to success? Because sometimes the greatest lessons don't come from the most powerful nations. Sometimes they come from the smallest,